college, on that semester at sea program I've spoken about here before, I was blessed to have the opportunity to dock in Cuba. This was 2004, so trips to Cuba weren't exactly the everyday for most of us US citizens. Neither was the experience of being brought into an auditorium to hear a speaker present to us for 4 hours straight without once sitting down or taking a sip of water. That man was Fidel Castro. Castro was unassuming in his speech, a very gentle presenter that lulled many of my fellow students to sleep, quite literally. It was quite the sermon. Can you imagine? 4 hours. And my time in Cuba was quite the learning experience. Castro took the opportunity to send each one of us 600 students home with booklets of information about Cuba. It was a cardboard box with handles for each one of us about this big. I still have it somewhere. It was heavy as lead. Most students left them on the ship. And it was very interesting to tease out what was real from what was sham that we were being shown in Cuba. This was also a heavy thing and quite fascinating. Castro and the Universidad de Havana were personally overseeing us while we were in their country. They served as tour guides. We later learned that they were only permitted to escort us down certain, somewhat more fancy streets in Havana, and they were heavily trained in what to say to us, or rather what not to say. A number of us left those tours quickly and went off on our own to talk to locals to try and suss out truth from falsehood. The locals, too, though, had been warned not to talk to us about anything but the most upbeat and hopeful of topics. I don't know how true this was, but one local told a friend of mine that Castro himself had gotten on the national radio station and told folks to be friendly and welcoming to us in a sort of warning. Still, some truths emerged during my time in Cuba. There was the doctor who confided to us that he could barely feed his family, because while Cuba at the time took great pride in education, there was simply no place on the small island for him to practice. There was the baseball game we attended where we saw many young people plow heart, mind, and body into the sport, seeing it as their only ticket off the island. There was the student who in whispers told us he wished he could hide on our ship so he could get away. Would we please take him with us? And everywhere there were signs of poverty. All of that is true. However, there were also deep signs of resilience and contrast. I saw that very clearly in one observation and one story from a friend. I'd like to share those two with you. I first observed that when I walked on the streets of Havana, I had the distinct impression that I was stepping into an old movie. Not just because there were armed, uniformed guards on every street corner, though they were there too, but because every street was lined with cars that looked like they were from the 1960s. None of them was abandoned, as they probably would be here. They worked perfectly. Because of the US imposed embargo, the country had not had access to newer cars or parts, so they reused, recycled, became darn good at making something out of very, very little. I'm not sure resilience and inner strength was the intended result of the embargo when it was first placed upon Cuba, but it certainly was the impact. Then the story. A friend of mine was interacting with one of the students from the Universidad, and they were talking about expectations upon graduation, specifically regarding hoped-for salaries. Two college folks talking about their future. My friend was sharing what his father earned as a middle-level manager in a small company here in the US, but the Cuban student did not seem to understand. My friend's Spanish wasn't great, and they thought there was some mistranslation about the dollar amounts. So my friend wrote out for the Cuban student the numbers of the salary. As it turned out, my friend's Spanish was fine. The Cuban student understood perfectly, and my friend's Spanish had been correct, but the issue was that he found it beyond belief. That was too many zeros in that number. The contrast between what this Cuban man could reasonably expect for his future and what he was seeing from his peer in the US, they were unbelievably different. So why am I talking about this? While not often as stark as what I observed in Cuba, I'm inclined to think we all make comparisons like these, especially in terms of wealth. In a town like Milford, where there is a vast disparity of wealth, perhaps some of you might resonate with this. We might not see 1960s cars parked on a street as a matter of routine. If we do, they have been well tended to and well taken care of. But we do notice the differences between cars, between housing choices, between how much food we have or do not have in our pantries. So perhaps we might also resonate with our scripture for today. Two men arrive at the temple to pray. One is a Pharisee and says this, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves and rogues and adulterers, or even like that tax collector over there. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. God, thank goodness, I am who I am." But the tax collector, sitting farther away, cannot even look up to heaven. He is beating his breast, a sign of lament, and is saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Jesus, of course, says that the tax collector is justified and says the familiar phrase, probably for many of us, "Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." So this passage always reminds me of the old minister story of the person who comes up to the pastor at the end of the service and says, "Reverend, I'm so glad you preached that message on judgment today. Thank you so much, because that person over there, they really needed to hear it." So the danger in all of this, right, is when comparisons with others leads to a lack of self-awareness and self-reflection. When comparisons with others leads us to a lack of self-awareness or self-reflection. Nearly every week in this sanctuary, I mention that our identity is rooted in being beloved children of God. I'm a bit repetitive about that. Here's the secret, though. I don't do it to be repetitive. I name that because I think it matters so much. If we know that we are beloved, there is a sense of enoughness about that. We are who we are. What we do is enough for God. We don't need to hustle for God's love. If we internalize that about ourselves, it will be a game changer in terms of how we spend our time and how we center our spirits. And if we believe that about each other, that everyone else is just as beloved as we are, it will affect how we interact and commune. And those comparisons will be a lot harder to make. This affects our sense of time, our talents, and yes, our treasure too. We're in the midst of stewardship season at our church. You'll very soon be receiving letters written in part by me and largely by Bettina, our stewardship chair for this year. Thank you, Bettina. And you'll soon be hearing from some of our members from this pulpit or the lectern about why they give to the church and how they suss out what to give. A wise mentor once told me to never ask a church member to do something you wouldn't do yourself. That's a good thing to keep in mind. And with that in mind, I thought I'd kick off the season by sharing a bit about what goes into my family's decision to pledge. So every year in October, Kevin and I sit down to talk about what to give to our churches. We pledge to 3 churches. A portion of Kevin's salary goes to St. Tim's and his yearly missional church. This year it's St. Thomas's in Bethel. And a portion of my salary comes back here. It's the best way we know how to kind of separate those things. To figure out amounts, we look at our monthly expenditures. And then we look at our history of car payments. We don't own 1960s cars. They're a little newer. But here's a question, folks. How many of you have ever made payments on a car or are making payments on a car? All right, I'm seeing a ton of hands. It's great fun, right? Yeah. Kev and I have collectively paid off 5 cars over the course of our 15 years together. We look at car payments, though, and this is the image I always use when discussing pledging with churches. Because, and bear with me on this, it'll make sense as we go along, our church is like our car. Now, I love my car. It's actually really important to me. It gets me where I need to go. I actually just had it in for an oil change on Friday that turned into needing 2 front tires. You know how this goes. I take good care of my car. My car is now going on 10 years old, so it's paid off. But when I was working on that, I dutifully made my car payments. Because if I didn't have my car, I would be very limited in what I can do. That monthly payment hurt a bit every month. We see that money going out, and it stings a little, right? But it didn't make me destitute. Our pledge to our church should be something like that. It's a sacrifice. It's a sign of faith and a commitment. It actually should sting a little. And I don't say that very much in the church, but it should. It should sting a little. My monthly pledge to Woodmont UCC is about as much as what a monthly car payment would be for my family. I could tell you that number, and I would be happy to in conversation because I don't believe it needs to be a secret. But frankly, that number would not be instructive for you if, for example, you drive a Ferrari on a daily basis. It would mean even less if you drive a 25-year-old Chevy. And it would mean even less if you have never owned a car, or if you, like our Cuban friends, repair used cars over and over and over with little resources to do so. In our community, we afford different kinds of cars. And we can afford to give different pledges to. Some of us can afford thousands of dollars per month. Some of us hundreds. Some of us just a few dollars. I can tell you for a family of 4, with 1 full-time pastor and 1 part-time pastor's salaries, living in Fairfield County, Connecticut, with 2 kids with special needs and medical concerns, one of us just having completed a doctorate, the other starting, with basically paying for those out of pocket. Pledging to 3 churches in this way, it stings a little. We'll be increasing our pledge to Woodmont by almost 15% for next year, and that's a jump for us. But there's a rather gut-wrenching 8.9% estimated cost of living increase, inflation increase for our country in 2023. So we always try to increase by something beyond that so as to just kind of keep up, right? But we're doing this out of gratitude for what Woodmont UCC has been for us, and for me specifically. We give what we can, because our church is like our car. My church gets me where I need to go. Without my church, without you all, I would be very spiritually limited. This place helps me with sight and with love, and it has galvanized me towards holy action. I pray it is the same for all of you. Friends, when we know the mission of our church, we realize that there is no place quite like it in the world. We get a lot of offers for us to give money to organizations in the mail, in phone calls, especially as we near the year's end, the holiday season. This ramps up, and we are one voice in that, but I think we're an important voice in that. The mission of this church is to see, and to really see, our belovedness, and then to love and to act from that place. When we respond to that call with faith, then we will be a healthy community, both spiritually and fiscally. So, beloved of God, back to the title of my sermon this morning, what do you drive? Better put, what drives you? Is it a desire to compare yourself to others as we survey parking lots around town, or our parking lot? Or is it a sense of your belovedness, and of everyone's belovedness? Is it just a whisk of the pen across a checkbook, one check of many written, I'm sure? Or is it a frank self-reflection of where you are, where your finances are, and a conversation with loved ones and with God about what is possible? Some people give faithfully a true reflection of gratitude. For others, it is a prettified offering like the self-satisfied Pharisee or the vision of Cuba that Fidel Castro wanted us to see. But what drives you, beloved of God? May it be a question that we all ask with honest self-reflection of your belovedness, of the importance of this church to you, and of what you are called to do. In the name of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit.